Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Charlotte Gallagher, and in the early hours of Thursday the 16th, these are our main stories. Italy has declared a state of emergency in Genoa and its region after the collapse of a motorway bridge. President Trump is revoking the security clearance of former CIA Director John Brennan. Also in this podcast.
The white or square-lipped rhino, a remnant of prehistory, is threatened with extinction. The Umfolozi Game Reserve in South Africa is perhaps their last stronghold.
We hear from our reporter in South Africa about how corruption in the same game park may be ruining the conservation effort today, and why New Zealand has banned foreigners from buying homes. But first to Italy, where rescue teams are still hoping to find survivors in the rubble of the collapsed bridge in Genoa. Marcello De Angelis from the Italian Red Cross said they would not give up.
We're still going on with the search. Planned to work on the site for a week. So obviously we're not giving up. We will start carrying on with the search until we have found at least all the missing persons.
The disaster on Tuesday killed more than 39 people. Details about those victims are now beginning to emerge. A young family who are on holiday and an amateur footballer on his way to work are among the dead. Our reporter Dan Johnson has been at the site during the day.
Well, there is still work going on here into the evening. A lot of rescue teams still busily trying to search through that rubble. There's some heavy-duty equipment here, excavators and huge cranes that have been brought in to shift the rubble, the big boulders of wrecked concrete that are left piled up at the bottom of this valley now, where the bridge span was yesterday. They've admitted, as this afternoon's gone on, that this is less of a rescue mission and more of a recovery operation. They're not really expecting to be able to pull anyone out alive now after more than 24 hours since this bridge collapsed. But there are still people missing. There are families here waiting for news. So they're determined to carry on to account for everyone, whether dead or alive. But this is still dangerous, delicate, difficult work.
And obviously the impact is going to be huge. We're hearing there's going to be a year-long state of emergency for the entire region now.
Yes, that's just been granted late this afternoon by the Italian Prime Minister. It means that emergency funds can be made available from central government for the regional authorities here. And the Prime Minister said $57 million will be made available. And that's not just to recover from what's happened here and perhaps to rebuild this bridge. That will go some extent to checking and examining other pieces of infrastructure in this part of the country, and I expect that will happen beyond as well, because there is concern that what's happened here may show a history of neglect in terms of the maintenance of some big old structures like this. So what was it that caused that weakness? That is the critical question that everyone wants answered, and the politicians here are promising that there will be accountability, that people will be held responsible for whatever went wrong here.
As we heard there, a year-long state of emergency has been declared in the region around Genoa, and the Public Prosecutor's Office in the city will begin a criminal investigation. Some critics are pointing to the design flaws in the bridge built in the 1960s. Many have singled out the use of pre-stressed concrete in the construction, and the politicians are also looking for scapegoats. Danilo Tonielli is the Transport and Infrastructure Minister from the populist Five Star Movement, part of Italy's governing coalition.
A
modern and civilized country like Italy cannot let tragedies like this one happen. It's not acceptable. And those who are responsible must be made to pay for it. The first thing we'll do, of course, is to examine the terms of the contract with the motorway operator, Autostrade per l'Italia, and suspend their licence. We also need to impose severe sanctions over what seems to me, very obviously, to be a failure to fulfil their very clear obligations in terms of maintenance and safety. It's up to the operating companies to carry these out. And if a bridge, like the bridge in Genoa, has collapsed, it means the maintenance has not been done properly.
The Italian Senator Lucio Milan from Silvio Berlusconi's party made clear that he believed the fault did not lie with previous Berlusconi governments.
It has absolutely nothing to do with the bridge we are speaking about, because the bridge has been run since 1998 by a private company who has a very, very good financial situation, huge profits, huge cash flow, and by huge I mean 4 billion of yearly cash flow and 2 billion almost of profit. So they weren't lacking resources, and the spending cuts have nothing to do with that. Of course, we will have to make any kind of controls and of double check about all the other infrastructure that depend directly from the government.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next, because Corriere della Sera says that 5 bridges have collapsed in the last 5 years. Are you worried about Italy's broader infrastructure here? Is there a period of really widespread checking that now needs to be carried out?
For sure. We should treat every one of those 5 events separately, because they are very special situations each. They're different one to another. Maintenance is very important. We are supportive of that. The current government has done nothing yet.
And Autostrada per l'Italia, the company in charge of the bridge, has responded in a statement saying that not only did it carry out its legal obligation to monitor the bridge every 3 months, it used highly specialised techniques in accordance with international best practice. Donald Trump has revoked the security clearance of the former CIA director John Brennan, denying one of his fiercest critics access to sensitive information. The White House press secretary Sarah Sanders announced the decision by reading a statement from the president.
Mr. Brennan has recently leveraged his status as a former high-ranking official with access to highly sensitive information to make a series of unfounded and outrageous allegations, wild outbursts on the internet and television about this administration. Mr. Brennan's line and recent conduct, characterized by increasingly frenzied commentary, is wholly inconsistent with access to the nation's most closely held secrets.
So do we have any idea about what these allegations are? A question for our White House reporter, Tara McKelvey.
It's kind of hard to know exactly what Mr. Trump's talking about, but he could be describing the way that Mr. Brennan had accused him pretty much of treasonous behavior after his press conference and his conversations with Mr. Putin in Helsinki. But Mr. Brennan's been very, very forthright about his criticism of Mr. Trump. Even early on, during the transition, Mr. Brennan had been hesitant about the Trump administration, and afterwards, Mr. Brennan has completely let loose with his accusations against him and his criticism, and very pointed criticism. And a lot of times, you can tell it stung for Mr. Trump. He's reacted very strongly.
And practically, what does it mean when you revoke someone's security clearance? What kind of documents will he not be able to see now?
It means that Mr. Brennan would not be able to go into top secret briefings at the White House, for example, or he wouldn't be able to be included in discussions about high-level classified information. And sometimes former CIA directors are invited in and they speak with the president about issues like that. But the relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Brennan was already so bad, the chances of him receiving any invitations like that were unlikely.
How significant of a move is this to treat a former CIA chief in this way and questioning his behaviour?
It's very significant. I mean, Mr. Brennan doesn't need the security clearance. He's appearing on television, as you know. It's not as though it's going to make any real difference for him in his daily life. But it's a really important thing that Mr. Trump has done this. It's a spiteful act, you could say.
And has John Brennan responded to his security clearance being taken away?
Mr. Brennan has also lashed out and said that Mr. Trump has consistently tried to reduce or revoke or clamp down on critics of the administration. And Mr. Brennan shows that he has no plans at all of letting off on his criticism of Mr. Trump.
The Afghan Ministry of Public Health says at least 48 people have been killed in a suicide bombing that targeted an education centre in the capital, Kabul. From Kabul, Shoaib Sharifi reports.
Up to 100 students had gathered in a large classroom at the centre to learn mathematics during the school summer holidays. The attacker entered through the back door and detonated his explosives in the middle of the classroom. The explosion was so huge that the entire ceiling collapsed on rows of benches packed with the students. Dasht-e-Barchi is populated mostly by the Shiite minority. In the last 12 months, there have been a number of suicide attacks on centres like this, mosques and other busy Shiite gatherings. The so-called Islamic State group have said they were responsible for most of the attacks.
To New Zealand now, often described as one of the most desirable places to live in the world, with lots of space and some stunning scenery. But such is the demand for homes that prices have shot up by 60% in the past decade. Foreigners have been blamed and the government has stepped in, passing legislation restricting foreigners from buying residential property. James Menendez has been speaking to New Zealand's Economic Development Minister David Parker. So what's the government hoping to achieve with this new law?
Well, it's a strongly held view in New Zealand that it's the right of people who live permanently in our country. It's their birthright to buy our homes, and we want the New Zealand market for existing houses to be determined by demand pressures from New Zealanders, not an international market.
Foreign buyers, they don't make up a huge amount of the market. I mean, just over 3%. Is it that much of a problem?
It varies. In a recent quarter in central Auckland, 20% of the buyers were from overseas. In the Queenstown Lakes district, which is a beautiful area in the central South Island, in a recent quarter they were 10%. So that's undoubtedly having an effect on the marginal price. We have the view that this applies throughout the sort of the social spectrum. We think the most beautiful sort of lakeside properties or bays ought to be purchased by our most successful New Zealanders, but that's true all the way down the tree to the most modest house in a suburb somewhere, which is nonetheless someone's dream.
Australians and Singaporeans are exempt from these new rules. Why is that exactly?
Australia's exempt on a reciprocal basis. They've got a similar ban, and we've each got the right to live permanently in each other's countries, and we've got freedom of movement. In respect of Singapore, it's because of a provision in an old trade agreement that we're honouring.
And what about the argument that it suggests that New Zealand is sort of retreating from the world, that it's now closed for business, I think is the argument put forward by the opposition party. I mean, they also use the word xenophobic.
Well, they're quite wrong on that. We're one of the most multicultural countries in the world. We have high rates of migration. We've got high rates of foreign direct investment into our economy. We just think that in this world where you've got concentration of wealth accruing to the top 1% around the world, that you've got to be a bit careful that you don't let that ruin your settings at home.
But what if you want people to come and invest in New Zealand, perhaps set up companies, entrepreneurial people? They need somewhere to live, don't they?
Well, they can do that, and those sorts of people would be entitled to apply for a long-term visa, permanent residency or citizenship, so long as they've committed themselves to our country, putting their shoulder to the wheel of our economy, paying taxes here. They're treated as New Zealanders.
Isn't the real solution that governments just need to make sure that enough homes are built? That's the only way to allow people to get that foot on the housing ladder, isn't it?
You've got to address both supply and demand measures. This is a measure that addresses demand. And indeed, in New Zealand, every few decades it seems to fall to the government to roll up our sleeves and build some more affordable starter homes so that people can get into their first home.
New Zealand's Economic Development Minister David Parker. Edvard Upiensky, the Soviet children's writer who gave life to some of the USSR's most popular cartoons, has died in his home in Moscow at the age of 80.
Кто там?
Это я, Чебурашка.
Чебурашка.
Кто вы такой? Я не знаю.
Cheburashka, a strange, small creature with brown hair and big ears, and Gaynor the crocodile, a friendly crocodile who works in a zoo and plays the accordion, as you do. Now, Alexander Kahn told me what was so special about the characters.
They are treasured and valued, not only by children, they are treasured and valued by grown-ups. Even though aimed specifically at children, the images and the characters that he created, Gaynor the crocodile, Cheburashka, Uncle Fyodor, Postman Pechkin, the old woman Shapaklyak, they are like proverbial, they are generic terms. Everybody knows them. They've become a real folklore of the nation.
You see, obviously you're not a child anymore. It might have been many years since you first started watching them, but they roll off your tongue, don't they? The names
Absolutely.
of them.
That's what I'm saying. I've written this piece today, and it had such a tremendous response. People are writing back saying that how they loved, how they know these characters.
And what kind of stories were they?
Some of the stories were from a supposedly like everyday life of a normal Soviet child who lives at a dacha outside Moscow. He lives with his cat, and the cat talks, of course, and the cat is very sardonic, very dogmatic kind of character, and there's this postman who comes there. So they're kind of like everyday characters, but you see the relationship between them, and they're permeated with this kindness and humor. And the other films with the more famous characters even, like Genoa the crocodile or Cheburashka and the old woman Shapakliak. I mean, so, and again, the relationship is very kind, and then there's humor, there's friendship, there's jealousy, but there's nothing which would be acrimonious.
Alexander Can. Still to come in the podcast, from the Grammys to The Godfather. We remember the jazz singer and actress Morgana King. Rhinos are being killed by poachers at a rate of more than 1,000 a year in South Africa, which is home to 80% of the continent's herd. Their horn may be made of the same material as fingernails, but it's worth more than cocaine in Asia, where it's used as a medical remedy or increasingly as a status symbol. But a BBC investigation has found it's not just the consumers or traffickers who are to blame. Corruption among South African police, rangers and in the judiciary is said to be allowing criminals to continue the killing. Alistair Leithhead looks at the measures being taken to protect the animals and the challenges faced.
Let's jump on. At a private game reserve in KwaZulu-Natal, a team of conservationists are searching for rhinos. We can hear the helicopter above. That's directing the two white rhino just about 50 metres in front here. They don't like the downdraft and the sound of the helicopter, so they're basically herding them into a position so that the vet, who is poking out of the small helicopter with the darting gun, can then shoot. And then there'll be 3 or 4 minutes to try and guide them to the road so that they're nearby for the dehorning to start.
Hands. Ropes, someone.
But the rhino has fallen awkwardly. They have to turn him so he's not hurt while sedated.
We won't remove a lot because this is live tissue, so you can only remove probably 1.5 inches off it.
Dave Gilroy is a wildlife conservation manager. This rhino was last dehorned 18 months ago.
Even that is still an attractive amount of horn.
The vet carefully manoeuvres a chainsaw. The animal is blindfolded and his ears are blocked, but it's painless, just like cutting fingernails. It's even the same material, keratin. But even the shavings flying off are worth a fortune in Asia, where they're used for medicine or as a status symbol. They're also collected. Well, this is the point that it's got to. You've got to remove the horns from these animals to stop them from being killed. This is common practice now across many of the private parks here, but in places like Shishlowe Imfolozi Park, this isn't done, and that makes them even more of a target. It's just too expensive in big government-run parks like Shishlowe Imfolozi. Groggy and confused, the rhino headed off into the bush.
The white or square-lipped rhino, a remnant of prehistory, is threatened with extinction. The Umfolozi Game Reserve in South Africa is perhaps their last stronghold.
This 1962 film, To Catch a Rhino, shows how southern white rhinos were saved then by being caught and translocated to other parks.
To be accurate, the heavy dart must be fired at close range, 25 yards at most.
So all of Africa's remaining 20,000 or so white rhinos originated here. But ironically, it's now Shishlowe Imfolozi Park that's the most poached place on the continent. We secretly met one of the rangers who didn't want to be identified.
Half of Shishlowe Imfolozi field rangers are corrupt. Many people, many field rangers in reserves, many are totally involved in rhino poaching.
But the head of rhino security at KwaZulu-Natal Wildlife, Cedric Kutsia, denies this.
Is half the park corrupt?
No.
Simple as that?
Simple as that.
You know that? I know that.
How big a problem has corruption been over the past few years at the park?
There has been corruption in terms of some areas, and we believe we've tackled those areas. We've also passed that information on to the South African Police Services.
But he agrees with the ranger that the conviction rate for poachers could be higher.
We arrest people in possession of rhino horns, but they have gone to court and have been found not guilty, and they are freed. It's because of corruption. These people, these kingpins, have lots of money. They give it to the police, to the lawyers.
These are not empty accusations. An investigation has been launched into lawyers, prosecutors and magistrates in KwaZulu-Natal. And we've spoken to a police informant who alleges there's a direct link between suspected rhino horn kingpins and some courts in KwaZulu-Natal.
Alistair Leithad reporting. At least 23 children have drowned in Sudan after their boat sank in the River Nile. More than 40 people were on board. A woman who worked at a local hospital also died. Caroline Hawley has more details.
The children were on their way to school when the boat they were travelling in capsized during bad weather. The Sudanese news agency said it was carrying more than 40 children and the currents in the water had been strong. The head of a local school, Abdelkhair Adam Yunus, said the boat had hit a tree trunk when its engine failed.
The children panicked and leaned to one side and the boat capsized. Some who were in high school managed to get out and the rest, 23, died. The oldest student was around 16 years old and she studied in the high school, but the rest were all primary school pupils.
Mr. Yunus said the children used to walk to school, but had come by boat over the past few days because of flooding, which he blamed on the construction of a nearby dam. Most of the dead, he said, were girls, among them 5 sisters. Rescuers are still searching for all of the children's bodies.
Reports from Austria say an Afghan migrant who says he's gay has had his asylum request turned down on the grounds that he did not walk, behave or dress like a homosexual. Mike Sanders reports.
It's been called the craziest ever reason for rejecting an asylum request. An official assessing an 18-year-old who arrived alone from Afghanistan reported that the teenager showed no gay characteristics. The lad's tendency to fight with his roommates betrayed an aggression that wasn't to be expected in homosexuals, he wrote. Also, he was a bit of a loner, the official noted, asking, aren't homosexuals rather sociable? Gay rights groups have condemned the stereotyping. The man is to appeal.
It's emerged that the jazz singer and actress Morgana King, who played the wife of Marlon Brando's character in The Godfather, has died at the age of 87. Her death in March had gone unreported until a friend posted a tribute on Facebook. Although she never achieved mainstream success, Morgana King's operatic style of jazz gained her many famous fans, including Billie Holiday, Frank Sinatra and Stevie Wonder. As our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson reports, Morgana King once said she'd been rehearsing all her life for her part in The Godfather.
The opening wedding scene in The Godfather. In that voice leading the celebrations, jazz singer Morgana King playing Carmela Corleone, the wife of Marlon Brando's Don Vito Corleone. Her character made quite an impression. It's no coincidence that in The Sopranos, the wife of mob boss Tony Soprano was also called Carmela. When it came to filming her funeral in The Godfather Part 2, Morgana King refused to lie in a coffin for superstitious reasons. The director Francis Ford Coppola had to persuade his own mother to be a body double. Morgana King had been chosen for the role because of her success as a singer.
Yeah, I'll come on back, honey, for that honey and you.
At the 1964 Grammys, she was nominated for Best New Act, but lost out to the Beatles. This led to her signing for Frank Sinatra's Reprise Records.
It's a quiet thing.
Morgana King recorded more than 20 albums and sang in nightclubs for half a century. Once, when asked about her career, she explained, I'm a rebel. I'm not a commercial artist. The only thing I believe in is music. I won't forfeit anything for that.
That report from Colin Patterson. And that's all from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Charlotte Gallagher. Until next time, goodbye.